this video is supposed to be a helpful hints video for painting rocks on the beaches that we have on the BC coast. That's the west coast of Canada. We see a lot of rocks like this on the beach, and this goes with a painting that I was doing of a BC beach, and I didn't want to include a long video on painting the rock, so I thought I'd just do a little aside one that you can link to. Now, this first rock had a background of raw sienna that had dried, and then I have mixed dark brown using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and as you can see, I've put that on quite wet, and now I've cleaned my brush and wiped it on my towel, and that's made it into a thirsty brush so that I can lift up the color on the top of the rock, the highlight of the rock. Now, the reason for doing this is to give a very soft edge to the rock, because some of these rocks do have soft edges. They're not hard, jagged rocks that have a lot of sandstone in them. And the other thing it does is it gives a soft, dark edge to the rock. Whereas if you outline the rock, it has a much more outline look. It just doesn't have that nice dark edge with the soft highlight. Now, what I'm doing now, the rock has dried, and you can see it's dried a lot lighter than when the paint was wet, and I'm using my rigger brush and my black silver velvet brush to add some details, to add some dark details. And a lot of the rocks have some cracks in them and little dips and dark pieces of other rock, and I want to put shadow. So I'm using the same color that I used before, the burnt sienna mixed with the ultramarine blue, and I'm being a little bit more careful where I put the dark color. I'm wetting the edge to keep it nice and soft. Now, this is the method I use the most when I'm painting rocks. Whoops, I got a little bit over the edge there, just clean that up. And sometimes you may need 3 or 4 layers before you get the shadow side dark enough, but that's okay. Working up slowly gives you a chance to model the rock and make it look three-dimensional. I'm trying to add a little bit of shading on the front and in some dips in the rock, make it look a little bit more craggy. And now I'm showing you what it looks like when you put some shadow under the rock. Of course, if you just leave it like that with no shadow underneath, it's going to look like it's floating on the surface. So you need to make sure that under your rock there is some dark shadow. I use just mostly ultramarine blue, maybe ultramarine blue mixed with a little rose, or again with the burnt sienna, or maybe sepia. And I'm using a little raw sienna around the edges to simulate sand color. And of course, this is very basic. This is just a quick showing you how I would do that. Now I have a few samples here. I've put down yellow ochre, raw sienna, and quinacridone gold because they're all very similar. You can see the first column is 1 layer and the second column is 2 layers, and now I'm seeing how well you can lift the paint. The raw sienna is the best one. You can lift back to white paper. Quinacridone gold, beautiful intense color, but stains the paper and you can't lift it back as well as you can with the raw sienna. I don't like the yellow ochre. For me, it's too opaque. I like the transparency or translucency of the raw sienna more, and I love the intensity of the quinacridone gold, so I may use either one. Now, I'm showing 2 methods here. One is when I've put the raw sienna on and let it dry, and the second method is using a wet and wet method. So I'm going to put on the wet raw sienna paint, and then I'm going to work directly into it with the dark color, with the burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue. And you can do either way. You don't have to do the method where the raw sienna is dry and then you put a second layer. You can work wet and wet, and I'm darkening up one edge with a bit more ultramarine blue in the color, putting some shadow. And if you want some quick rocks that are not particularly a focal point, that's a great method. Now, when I'm doing the one that's been previously painted with the raw sienna, I wet one edge to show you again. You don't have to paint all over the rock and then lift. You can just wet your highlight edge to get your soft edge and put your dark colour in the shaded areas. A third method. You don't get the dark edge, but maybe you don't want that, or maybe you can put dark behind it, which I will show you when this is dry, how you can put dark paint behind it to make your light edge stand out. And don't forget, these are all just little samples. They're not finished paintings. They're just ideas of different ways you can do rocks in your painting. If you just dab some of these rocks you've painted with a bit of Kleenex tissue, clean tissue, you can get some nice texture in the rock too. And you can also, I'll show you in a moment, when the rock on the right is dry, you can use a dry brush and just stipple on some texture and get another beautiful look to your rock. So I'm just using my Kleenex to dab back a little of the paint and give it some texture. And then a third method, I'm using this time the yellow ochre, which is the more opaque colour, and cerulean blue, which is a more opaque blue, and they both together will often granulate, which gives a very nice look to a rock. Actually, it makes it look grainy and rocky. So I'm showing how you can use that, and again I'm using my Kleenex to pull off some highlights there. And if you're not doing too many layers and you don't risk mud, you can use that method. I'm sprinkling a little bit of salt on there to give some texture to the rock. And sometimes if you do that on your rock, you have a beautiful look of sort of crystals in the rock. So this one I've put the raw sienna on first, and then the burnt sienna and a little bit of dab of tissue. I'll show you 3 different rock colours here that you can experiment with. And some ultramarine blue at the back mixed with the burnt sienna to give a little bit of shadow. And I will finish this one off as a little painting. Now I've mixed some sepia with some phthalo blue, I believe, the ultramarine blue, and made a very dark brown. And I'm going to use a little bit more of the phthalo blue, or if you wanted to use, you could use Prussian blue, use indigo. And you don't have to use sepia. Sepia is just my favorite sort of neutral brown. You can use burnt umber, you can use Van Dyke brown, any dark brown that you like to use. And I'm lifting off with my thirsty brush, which I like because it does give that dark edge to the top of the rock. And you can see there's a white space between the 2 rocks. That's just because I didn't want to have the paint bleeding, but I will fix that when it's dry. Now I'm giving an extra layer of shadow behind this rock, using this time the sepia with the ultramarine blue, and softening it again with a wet brush. And there's nothing wrong with leaving hard edges on rocks. It's just that these rocks on the beach that I was painting didn't have that kind of edge to them. So I'm using a thirsty brush or a slightly damp brush to just model those edges. Remember, a rock is very solid, so it really needs to have the dark at the base and in the shadows to make it look solid. And you can work on lifting and putting 3, 4, 5 layers as each layer dries to work up the amount of dark that you would like in your rock, and the modelling and the cracks. And I like to use colours such as ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and sepia that you can wash back and that you can scrub off, so that I can take off paint if I don't like it. I'm using some burnt sienna with a bit of a dry brush technique to add a little bit more texture to the rock. And I'm just doing the same with this rock. I have some burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue on my brush, and I've tapped it on my towel to get it fairly dry, and I'm dragging my brush sideways over the darker parts of the rock to give some texture. Especially see that kind of texture on the sandstone rocks that we have around here where I live in British Columbia. So I can spend a long time modeling rocks. I'm trying to keep this video fairly short for you, just to show you some different methods. Now I want to show you how you can put a dark background behind the light side of the rock so that it stands out rather than outlining it, which often looks a little weird. But if you use some dark color behind the light rock, it will make it stand out and push it into the foreground. I just mixed up a sort of a grey colour with my Ultramarine Blue and Sepia and Burnt Sienna. And on the dark side of the rock, you don't want to do the same dark wash, you want to lighten it on the dark side. So I added a little bit of blue to that wash, when you see in a moment when I finish it off. Now I'm going back to these rocks to do my second layer of modelling. And the one reason I am not too keen on using the yellow ochre is that it is quite an opaque colour, and if you do too many layers of dark on the top, it gets muddy and you lose that translucency of paint. Not always a problem with rock. If you want your rock to look solid and grainy and gritty, that's okay. You can use these opaque colours. They're just not my favourites, that's all. I'm adding some Ultramarine Blue with the sepia to make the shadows, and I'll soften those up with a thirsty brush. Make some dips in the rock. Really take your time. You can get lost in the modelling of these rocks. And I'm filling in that light gap that I left so the paint didn't bleed. And you did notice that the paint bled a little bit, but you don't see it now that I've put the shadow paint on there. I'm giving that quite a hard, dark edge. And I finished this one with some ocean and sand, just so you could see what these rocks look like when they are placed in a picture. I didn't quite like what the salt did on these. I didn't put it in the right place, but you can see those little white dots on the rock on the right. That is where the salt has affected the pigment. But done properly, it's a beautiful method on rocks to give them texture. So now I'm putting in raw sienna mixed with a little cobalt blue to make a sort of a sand colour for the rocks to sit on, and again you'll need shadow under the rocks, and if the sand is wet you would have rocks reflecting in the wet sand, and that often looks very lovely on a painting too. And I'm using some burnt sienna to give a little warmth to the foreground rock. If you use a warm colour like burnt sienna, that will pull your items that you're painting into the foreground. So this is what it looks like when I put some ocean and some shadow and gave them a sort of a beach environment to sit in, so they're not just floating on the paper. And again, this is just an example. This is not a real finished painting or anything. But it does make a difference when you put the background in and put some shadow under the rock, and that's why I wanted to finish this picture for you. And I'm using a smaller brush to add more shadow, more detail. And you can always, I'm just scraping back some of the shadow to make it look like there's wet sand there, and I'm scraping it off in a horizontal way, so that will look even more like reflections on wet sand. Thank you for watching.